So I think feel free to stop me and ask questions as I'm going through. I can either just talk faster to cover stuff or skip stuff that may not relate directly to what we're doing here. But thanks for having me. What I'm going to be talking about is a bit of my research, and it sort of is an extension of the theme that sort of organisms are sort of confined to very specific environments, and that changes in those environments will have drastic changes on those organisms themselves. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about an area in the Canadian Arctic where I've been doing some research, and we found a neat thing, and I'm going to just describe what it's told us about climate in the past and maybe where climate's going in the future. So again, please stop me as I go, and we'll just see how it evolves from there. So here's Columbus. This is North America. Now we're going to go right up here to an island called Ellesmere Island. It's in northern Canada. It's the northernmost extent of North America. Bits of Greenland stick farther north, but we'll just talk about North America right now and feel good that we're going really far north. This is a satellite image of the area itself. Thanks. So what you'll notice here, the white is snow. This is an ice-covered Arctic Ocean. This is Ellesmere Island. There's a mountain range that sort of runs diagonally through the photo here. That's the Grant Land Mountains. They sort of dictate how climate works in this region. So basically storm systems come off the ocean, and because this is an area of higher elevation, they trap all the moisture. And so the moisture descending on the other side of the mountains is very dry, which is why there's no snow here. This is known as the Lake Hazen Plateau. This being Lake Hazen itself, it's the largest freshwater body north of the Arctic Circle in the world. The ecosystem here is known as Arctic desert. Most of the Arctic is in fact categorized as a desert because it gets so little precipitation in liquid form. Basically, all the liquid that the area gets occurs during snowmelt, and then there's very little rainfall thereafter. So it's a desert ecosystem, and so the organisms there have to be specifically adapted to it. Other things they have to be adapted to, it's cold. This is July, so the mean annual temperature in July is about 10 degrees Celsius, which I'm Canadian, I think in Celsius, but I wrote it down. 10 degrees Celsius is about 49 degrees Fahrenheit. From May to August, which is the growing season, it doesn't get much higher than 5 degrees Celsius, which is 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're a plant or an animal that relies on plants to live, you've got a pretty short growing season in which to get your work done. As a scientist, the same applies. So the organisms there have to be very well adapted. Here you see it's generally a barren landscape where you get lush plants growing sort of in these wetlands. And if you're a mammal, such as this muskox, you have very specific adaptations. You do well in this environment, you don't do well if that environment changes. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. This is just a bigger scale picture. These are the Grantland Mountains extending out to the Arctic Ocean. This is the landscape, pretty barren, relatively lush vegetation in the wetlands. Now, what I'd like you to take away from this picture is there's no trees. Okay. The vegetation that we have is dwarf fireweed, mountain avens, Arctic poppy. The only tree we have is this dwarf willow. It tends to grow about 5 centimeters off the ground and extend out laterally. Very well adapted to having snow cover, so snow completely covering it in the wintertime. Doesn't stick up where it can get dried out by blowing winds or anything like that. It takes advantage of what little moisture is available to it. But presently, in today's climate, this is what you've got. There are no trees. It's above tree line. Can anyone here, again, this is returning to a satellite image of North America, can you make out where tree line is? Tree line being defined as the northernmost extent of where trees grow. Beyond that, you get shrubs, and then eventually just what I've told you, the fireweed and that sort of thing. Can anyone see it? Yeah, just that tonal line right there. So we can put that there. North of that line, you don't get trees. What trees you have is that dwarf willow type, dominated by shrubs. So you can see we're well north of that. Tree line is defined by a temperature. Okay, so north of this line, the mean annual July temperature doesn't exceed 10 degrees Celsius. Trees can't grow. That's for a variety of reasons. Pardon me? No, please feel free, intro.
What is 10 degrees Celsius Fahrenheit? I always have trouble with that.
It's about 50 degrees, yeah. So for a variety of reasons. North of this line, sometimes the soils are frozen solid for much of the year, a condition known as permafrost. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Some plant species just need the warm temperatures to survive, so they obviously can't survive beyond that. Other unique conditions beyond this line is in the wintertime you've got 24 hours darkness, in the summertime you've got 24 hours of sunlight. So whatever vegetation or organisms that live in this region have to be specifically adapted to those conditions as well. So just as a little sidestep before we go much further, there's two terms that we'll have to know. You may have heard of petrified wood before. Show of hands, okay? Petrified wood is when you've had some sort of organic material that water has percolated through, and as it percolates through, it deposits minerals in this organic material. So then the wood, or any organic material, ends up looking more than a rock than the original material. So I've just got a piece here that we collected from up there. You can just pass around. You wouldn't really know it as being once wood, right? It's a rock, it looks like a rock. You really have to look at it closely to see sort of the wood anatomical features. Now mummified, as you might know, you think of Egyptian mummies, basically they've been preserved, but you haven't had any mineral replacement of anything. They've basically just been dried out. And so here I've got some wood that's mummified. It looks a lot more like wood. I found out, unfortunately, it burns like wood. It was a Celsius Fahrenheit mistake with the muffle furnace. I was trying to dry it out and I actually charred it. It looks like wood. But this wood that you're handing around right now is about 3 million years old. The petrified wood that's going around is about 5 million years old. So really, it's all about the conditions in which they were sort of deposited and preserved. It gives you what you're left with. So given, the vegetation that we have there now, the predominant vegetation, those dwarf willows, you can imagine our surprise when you stumble across something like this. Okay, this is mummified wood. These are tree trunks. Just as an idea of scale, this is a muskox print here, about the size of your hand. So these are big pieces of wood, indicating that at some point, climate was very much different in this part of the world. If you walk around this area, you see more and more of this stuff just lying around. Not only is it unique because of its age, you wouldn't necessarily know how old it is just finding it, but if you look at it very closely, this is a spruce tree. This is just a regular sized finger. It's not a giant finger by any means. But you can see it's a narrow tree trunk. And if you count the growth rings, as you would with any tree, it's about 90 years old. So this tells us that whenever these trees lived, the conditions were such that they couldn't allocate a lot of resources to actually growing. They weren't actually growing much. During whatever growing season they had, they were just sort of hanging on or surviving. So that tells us that whenever these things lived, they were adapted to climate, but climate was very harsh. They were just on the edge of their survival. Yes?
How did you know it was spruce, just from finding the wood like that?
You can look at some anatomical features. Softwoods are very much different than hardwoods if you look at them. And then spruce will look a bit different than pine and that sort of thing. Yeah. No problem. So we found a site where this stuff is sort of popping out, all this wood. And I'll show you more pictures of what else we found there. But again, just indicative that climate at some time in the past was very different. Now, in the interest of full honesty, full disclosure here, this isn't the only site in the Arctic where people are finding these things. There's about 12 others in Canada, one in Greenland, which I don't show, where wood like this and other vegetation is sort of sticking out of cliffs, sticking out of geological formations that were deposited in the past. Most of them, well, all of them, extend from about 40 million years ago. The Eocene, that's just a geologic period of time they've named. We'll take it as 40 million years ago. The youngest ones are from a period known as the Pliocene, which is ended about 2.5 million years ago with the onset of an ice age and the establishment of climate on Earth like we know it today. I'll return to that point a bit later. It's actually an important one within the context of this study and this talk. But point is, in the Arctic, there's evidence that climate was much different than it is today, as reflected by the vegetation that people are finding. Here's where we end up. And I sort of enjoy this slide because it shows that we're the most northern site by quite a fair bit. So if you sort of put what we've talked about in context, we've got these plants that were just hanging on. They were farther north than anywhere else that people have found these things. So we're looking at a plant community that was right at the threshold of its life, sort of what you'd know today as tree line, if you walked up a mountain where the trees stopped. So any change in climate would affect these plant species, this community, first. If it warmed up, they'd be the first to feel it. If it cooled down, they'd be the first to feel it. So I maintain that it's an important site, and I'm trying to argue that to the funding agencies.
Did you say that those two periods were both just prior to Ice Age, or just the
Pliocene? The Pliocene, yeah, was just prior to this last Ice Age that we had, and then the Eocene was about 40 million years ago, so quite a long time ago, and I'll show you why that's important in the next slide. Yes. All right. So this is a bit difficult to see. I'll just sort of trace it with my finger. Conveniently, this graph is flipped from this graph. So here we have time. In this case, going from present, 0, to 60 million years ago. Here, and we've got present here going to 60 million years ago here. And all you need to know about this is that it's plotting temperature on the planet. In this case, they're looking at organisms and shells that are deposited in the ocean, so they get an idea of ocean temperature, which is a reflection of what was happening with global temperature. So when the oceans got warmer, climate globally was warmer. Okay, so that's how you interpret this graph.
It's interesting though, because some of those old encampments, I think Canada's reestablishing them as official population centers and reopening old military bases and stuff now.
Yeah, geopolitically, the Arctic right now is pretty interesting. During the Cold War, there was all kinds of money for science because they wanted people to go up and look out for Russians coming over the top. The Cold War ended, and then science took a back seat. Why would we support people up there? Doesn't make any sense. During the Cold War, they moved populations from northern Canada farther north. They displaced people. Awesome, right? You didn't hear a lot about that. Why did they displace people? Because they wanted to establish territorial claims to those islands just in case the Russians tried to. And so now, even more ridiculous, with climate changing and the opening up of the Northwest Passage, so now you don't have to go down through Panama, you can just go over the top, and natural gas. No one is recognizing Canada's claim to those islands, including Ellesmere Island. And so Canada, again, is trying to establish a presence, saying, look, we're using it, we're there, we have populations. So it's like a very subtle Cold War, except this time it's against Russia, Denmark, the United States, Norway, Sweden, everyone. Yeah. But they're not putting money back into science.
Like in science, they tend to, like, if you look at Antarctica, for example, you have flags everywhere that say, like, this is our camp.
Yeah.
So no one, though, in theory, owns land on Antarctica.
No, but Antarctica is sort of a unique situation because it has been deliberately set aside that no one can establish these permanent camps. No one can actually own it. Everyone has these claims, but no one can actually own it and start extracting things.
And no one did that for the Arctic.
Oh, the Arctic's like frontier. Yeah, it's all about economy. It's all about gas and transport.
For them that they happen to have gas up there.
Well, it depends. if you're working for Exxon, it's pretty good.
If you were one of the people that got relocated.
Well, yeah. I'm not sure how they feel about it. Yeah. Anyway, we can talk about that after if you want, but we should probably plunge forward here. So basically, what this is recording is a history of the temperature of the Earth from sort of 60 million years ago to the present. And so you can notice that climate has always changed. Climate change right now, you hear a lot about it, and one of the arguments against why we should worry about it is that, well, climate's always changed, okay? Climate has always gotten warmer and colder, and that's true. But in the past, we've been able to point to factors that contributed to this warming and cooling. So for example, this climate warming here around 55 million years ago, known as the Eocene thermal maximum. That's when global temperatures were 6 degrees warmer than they are at present. And the rise took about 2,000 years to accomplish. So it was a fraction of a degree Celsius per year, but it continued for about 200,000 years to raise temperature to about 25 degrees Celsius, which was 6 degrees Celsius above what it was just prior to the rise. And the reason why that happened was because the Atlantic Ocean was rifting. It was being created. There was a lot of volcanism, a lot of degassing from the interior of the Earth, put greenhouse gases like CO2 into the atmosphere and enhanced the greenhouse effect. And I'll show a slide of going over the greenhouse effect in a minute. But you hear a lot about the greenhouse effect currently and why we shouldn't be putting CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's exactly why. Because going back in history, we've noticed that when we raise the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, climate warms. So here, we had that degassing, things sort of settled out, and then we had a bit of a bump. This is when Australia rifted from Antarctica. Again, lots of volcanism. New Zealand formed, lots of volcanism, lots of degassing, enhanced greenhouse effect. Here, we have this steep drop in temperature. That was due to Antarctica becoming isolated and ocean currents starting to change in the South Atlantic, basically making a cold spot on the planet that sort of permeated outwards. Okay? So all of that is really unimportant to this talk. All I want to show is that, yes, in the past, climate has gone up and down, or temperature has gone up and down in response to the greenhouse effect. So as we work our way to the Pliocene, we notice that temperature was sort of fading off, fading off. At the very edge of the Pliocene, right before that ice age and the climate that we have today, temperature was about 3 degrees warmer. Global temperature was about 3 degrees warmer than it is today. Our atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations were at 400, and we're going to return to that in a second. And we had trees in the high Arctic. Yes?
How do you collect these temperatures? Like how do you?
That's an excellent question. I wasn't going to get into that because it deals with isotope geochemistry. But basically, the oceans are these great big sedimentary basins. So all rivers flow into the oceans, and then the sediment gets deposited. So when people go on boats and take these big, long ocean cores, they're basically getting like a time history. That's how they get history of the Earth, because they've got sediment that's been accumulating in the oceans since they were there for 60 million years. Okay, so they've got a time series. And then they can look at, like some animals, when they build their shells, they have calcite in them that has oxygen, okay, oxygen atoms. And they can look at the specific form that those oxygen atoms take, and those oxygen atoms are dependent on what the temperature was when they were incorporated into the shell. So by looking at the chemistry of those shells through time, they can get an idea of what the temperature of the ocean water was. So that's how they do that. You can look at other records to get an idea of what atmospheric CO2 was, because you can do the same thing with atoms like carbon. Okay, there's carbon in CO2. You can look at the form that that carbon takes in whatever material that carbon was preserved in and get an idea of what the carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere at the time. So by meshing those two records, you can get an idea of how temperature has changed over time and what atmospheric composition was over time. Okay? So, late Pliocene, okay, we've got a forested Arctic. We know that from all these sites people have found in the Arctic. Global temperatures were only about 3 degrees warmer than today. Atmospheric CO2 is at 400 ppm. Okay? That's sort of the punchline to the whole joke. The other thing I should mention, remember I told you that this was formed because the Atlantic Ocean was forming. Continents were breaking apart. That's plate tectonics. So all through this history, continents were in different positions than they are today. By this period, 3 million years ago, North America was pretty much where it is today. So if we want to look at the climate of the Arctic, we can't argue that it had forests there because it was in a much more southerly location. No. At this point in time, the geographic position of the Arctic was where it was today. We had 24 hours sunlight, we had 24 hours darkness in the winter. That argument is out the window. If we want to look at climate in the Arctic during this period, we're looking at the world being a warmer place. We're dealing with climate rather than plate tectonics influencing things. So just as a primer, how does the greenhouse effect work? Well, the greenhouse effect, thankfully, has always been there, as long as we've been there. That's what makes the planet such a nice place to live. The sun's radiation comes in, warms the surface of the Earth. The Earth is a warm body, so it radiates energy back out into space. But some of that radiation that the Earth is putting out gets trapped in the atmosphere and keeps our planet warm. It's like putting a blanket over the world. If we thicken that blanket, less radiation can escape and the planet becomes warmer. And that's the greenhouse effect in a nutshell. When we're talking about climate change in history, we can discuss it within the terms of the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect, adding CO2, changing atmospheric chemistry, is responsible for the temperature fluctuations we see in this record. So the field site where we found this forest with this mummified material, we can only see it now because a glacier has carved through the valley. It's buried by all this material. This glacier has downcut through the valley and exposed the material as sort of a cross-section. The glacier is retreating. This is just some aerial photography showing this. So in 1960, it's difficult to see sort of like this. So this is a bedrock sort of hump here, and there's a little valley coming down beside. So if you want to sort of use that as a point of reference, you can see that the extent of the glacier has moved back past this valley in the 50 years between these two photographs. But also the glaciers become much thinner. So you can see on this picture, this modern one, we've got all these lines. These are just like little stream channels. So little rivers have cut down into the sediment. Here, we didn't have those because the glacier covered that area. These stream channels is what has exposed the material. So this is a picture of these stream channels. Again, here, our little outcropping is just up here. So you sort of walk around this area and it looks like anywhere else, except you see these logs sticking out, which is abnormal. That's not the vegetation we're familiar with.
Were covered by the glacier before, you're saying, right?
Yes, in fact, this
Now
forest.
that the glacier's receding, now you can see the debris.
Yes, that's right. And so then when you start digging into the dirt, you've got leaves. I mean, these are actual like leaves. It's kind of crazy. You've got these sort of concentrated accumulations of just brush like you'd see after a flood in any modern river. And this is another picture of a leaf here. You've got little seeds and nuts, more little leaves, and then these are bits of insects that you can find. You've got cones. This is interesting because it looks like it might have been eaten by something that lived there. We haven't found any mammals or anything like that yet, but we're definitely hoping to. Bits of birch tree, some 5-needle pine. This is a pine tree species that is no longer with us. It went extinct. Little leaves with actual material in it that's green. Alder leaf, oddly enough, we haven't found any alder wood. So just by looking at that, you can get an idea of what sort of community lived there. It was a mixed forest, insects, so there was water. The plant species we had liked water as well. So we weren't in a polar desert ecosystem at all. If we get a bit more complicated with our material, we start looking at the chemicals that are in the soil to get an idea of the community composition. This is unimportant. These are just the chemicals we're looking at that are characteristic of specific types of plant material. By looking at all these, you can see that we're sort of plot where we'd find a modern mixed wood pine forest. So whenever this was in the high Arctic, we had a mixed wood pine forest. So mixed boreal forest, mixed boreal forest, mixed boreal forest. our various lines of looking at things is telling us that that's what we had in the high Arctic whenever this forest was there. So whenever it was there, it looked something like this, and it has since evolved into something like this. So climate has changed. Okay, but why is that important? Well, it all depends on how old this is. So we haven't been able to find any evidence of this tree called metasequoia, and it's sort of an important one because its pollen was airborne, so it got distributed very widely. So if it was there, we'd expect to see it. We know that in this part of the world, metasequoia just left the scene about 5 million years ago. So we know that our deposit isn't older than 5 million years, and we know that we're not any older or any younger than 2.5 million years because that's when the Ice Age came through. That's when that wiped out all forests and climate changed for good. So we know we fall somewhere in there. And that puts us in the Pliocene. And that's where it starts to get interesting because has anyone heard of the IPC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Yeah, they issue these reports every 5 to 7 years. And basically what they do is they take a survey of all the science that's been produced regarding global climate. They put it all together and they come out with these reports that say, to the best of our knowledge, climate's going to look like this in 50 or 100 years. They've been saying for a while that by the end of this century or by halfway through this century, global temperature should increase 3 degrees. That sound familiar? Celsius, yes.
You said before 6 degrees Celsius and a 2,000-year period way back. Is that
40 million years ago, the Eocene.
It took 2,000 years.
2,000 years to do that.
Yeah. So yeah, we're kicking nature's butt. Like there's no problem.
50 years is going to go 3 years.
Right. That's predicted in the next 50 years. When we had this forest in the Pliocene, global temperature was 3 degrees warmer than it is presently. So if we want to get an idea of how the Arctic's going to look when this happens, we can look back into the past when conditions were very similar. The other kicker, did anyone hear about this? CO2 in the atmosphere right now is 400 parts per million, ppm. That's what it was in the Pliocene when our global temperature was 3 degrees warmer. Now, you might not have heard about this because it was released the same week that Angelina Jolie had the double mastectomy. No, I mean, it's not really a joke, but that's sort of, it got drowned out by that coverage. That's part of the difficulty that I think science has getting the message forward. Is it less interesting? Maybe. But anyway, that's part of the struggle. But anyway, CO2 right now is at 400 ppm. We are in the Pliocene as far as atmospheric chemistry goes. We're starting to see the temperature adjust. As we know from the Eocene, it can happen very slowly. It turns out that it's predicted to go much more quickly, and it is in fact going more quickly than it did in the Eocene. So conditions were very much different in the past. We're looking like we're sort of going back to the future. Or back to the past, I guess, in the Arctic. Yes?
I might be a little bit confused. So with this warming, and before you were talking about how the greenhouse effect is helpful, but now with this temperature increase, does this mean the atmosphere is getting thicker? I mean, when I'm trying to think because I think of ozone as part of atmosphere, right?
Yeah.
And there was all, we heard about the ozone layer thinning.
Right.
But you talked about the blanket effect and trapping the heat. So I'm trying
Right.
to understand exactly.
So the ozone,
Am I confused?
no, not at all. No, it's a great question, but you're starting to talk about the subtleties of atmospheric chemistry. And so what the ozone layer did was it sort of protected the Earth from a lot of UVA and UVB radiation coming in from the sun. So if we have an ozone hole, that harmful radiation is coming in. It's not getting deflected back out. So it's interacting with that end of the spectrum. What CO2 and greenhouse gases do is they interfere with the Earth's ability to dump radiation back into space, basically cool down by doing so. So if you want to use the analogy of there being a blanket, By putting a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're making that blanket thicker. The ozone hole would have been like a hole in the blanket, I guess, yeah. So rather than making the atmosphere thicker, you're making it denser. Yeah.
I guess my question is, looking at the levels of carbon dioxide and the temperature, it's basically saying that our carbon dioxide is too high for our current temperature looking back at history.
Yeah.
Because before it was 3 more degrees Celsius to get to this level of carbon dioxide.
Yes.
So we're technically too cold for the amount of carbon dioxide, right?
Exactly. We're waiting for the penny to drop. So we've pulled the trigger. We're waiting for the response now.
Oh, sounds fun.
Well, I mean, yeah, it depends on your perspective, I guess. Yeah.
Just to clarify, when we talk about the radiation that is trying to escape the atmosphere, we're talking about thermal energy, correct? Or
It's all energy. It's just different manifestations. So
we're not talking about light energy bouncing back necessarily as much as the planet's hot and now it's releasing.
yeah, so when you talk about light energy, that's just energy within the visible spectrum. So we're looking at energy just outside, infrared, so just outside the visible spectrum, and that's what interacts with greenhouse gases. So it's energy, it's just not manifest as light, it's manifest as temperature.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
When you were discussing the fact that it used to be a forest, the mixed forest, was that because it was at a lower latitude or because there was a warmer climate?
It's a warmer climate because by the Pliocene, North America is where it is today. Yeah, so we've managed to exclude continental drift from the argument. That's all climate. Yeah, by the Pliocene. Yes.
Now, when we talk about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it doesn't localize, does it? Like, it's not like this part of the atmosphere has 400 parts per million, and then on the other side of the world, this section atmosphere, does it kind of disperse and
Actually, that's
act as a system in itself?
That's a great question because, in fact, it is a bit localized. So, in fact, Barrow, Alaska reported atmospheric carbon dioxide of 400 ppm last spring. That's because they're a northern community. They didn't have a lot of vegetation, so there wasn't a lot of photosynthesis happening, and I'll cover that in a bit if we have time. I don't know how we're doing. But when they reported this was at Mauna Loa Observatory, which is right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So they consider that to be a reflection of global atmospheric conditions because things are well mixed enough by the time they get to Mauna Loa. So yeah, a bit of yes on both the points. It is localized, but it gets mixed over time.
And then I'm wondering,
400.
could that have significant impacts down the road too if humans are creating maybe a more extreme localization than what would naturally occur in the atmosphere? Could that affect climate in a certain way? Because we talk so much about in here about how everything's so intricately balanced. You know, it's a system that's very complex and balances out, and if there is an imbalance in one area, that's going to cause detriment somewhere else.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, there's a phenomenon called urban heat island effect, which cities tend to be hotter than the surrounding countryside. A lot of that's to do with buildings and air mixing and all that sort of thing. But, I mean, yeah, if you've got smog, like they have in Beijing, I mean, yeah, things are pretty crummy. Yeah, it's localized. But yeah, you're right, it does tend to get mixed over time. So pollution in one area is going to get mixed in the atmosphere and contribute to sort of they'll meet somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Sorry, just another quick question.
No problem.
So because the carbon dioxide is higher, that's going to cause our temperature to increase? Will then that temperature increase cause the carbon dioxide to go higher and then just kind of a balancing teeter-totter effect?
It's another great question, and I'm actually going to touch on that a bit if we have time going forward. So I'll explain, yeah, I'll hopefully address that in a bit, and if I don't, ask again. Okay? Is there a question in the back?
I have a quick question about, so if our temperature on Earth has been this warm in the past, is the concern with it getting this warm again that we aren't going to, or that only some things are going to adapt?
Well, that's the thing. I've got this uncle who doesn't believe any of this. And so at Christmas time, he tries to pin me down. So, I mean, planet Earth is going to do just fine, right? It's been hotter, it's been colder. Planet Earth is fine. We have only been around for a very short period of time, so we're the ones that have to adapt. So in Columbus, 3 degrees warmer in the summertime might be uncomfortable, but I don't think people are going to complain a lot. But if you live in Bangladesh, 20 million people living at sea level, and sea levels rise because it's getting warmer, yeah, that's going to be a problem. I mean, they talk about the buckeye tree. If things warm up 3 degrees per year, it won't be able to grow in Ohio. It'll grow in Michigan. So, right? So,
So people who can't live in their environments anymore will move, and then there'll be less resources for the people who are there, what have you.
yeah, so you'll have climate refugees, which is something I don't think we've seen since sort of people fled the Ice Age. Yeah. Yes.
So it seems like what you're saying is the Earth is going to survive all this, but
Yep.
our current agricultural, economic, transportation, that's what's going to be affected the most. So that's what's really we're concerned about here is how it's going to change, how the changes are going to affect how everybody kind of lives day to day.
Well, I mean, you can take multiple points of view. I mean, you can just be concerned about humans. Yep, you're going to have to change. It's going to be a rough ride. Or we can be concerned about other species on the planet that can't shift their geographic location due to whatever reason, and climate is changing, so they can no longer.
But that's happened in the past.
It has.
So, but now we're causing it to happen a little bit faster. So that's maybe the.
Yeah, I mean, and this is like the argument I have with my uncle. Yes, in the past, plate tectonics, continental drift, all that sort of stuff has caused climate change, and species have gone extinct or adapted. Fair enough. There's not a lot you can do about continental drift. It's going to happen. We, by accentuating the greenhouse effect and changing Earth's chemistry, if we can change it by that much, maybe we can change it back. If we're interested in saving muskox or whatever, animals that won't be able, if the planet warms, they're going to be out of habitat, they're going to be out of luck. So yeah, maybe climate change is fine for people. That's fine. We can adapt.
If we expect this warming, can we also expect another ice age?
That's an excellent question. There's a school of thought that yes. And that has to do with, I didn't bring the slides, but ocean currents, if we melt the ice caps, specifically in Greenland. Let me back up. Britain is much warmer than Newfoundland, right? But they're at the same latitude. And the reason why is because there's a warm ocean current that goes up past Britain, and it's cold when it comes back down Newfoundland way. If we put a bunch of fresh water from the Greenland ice cap in the North Atlantic, that could shut that current down. So we would no longer have the transport of warm water from the equator up that coast. So that would cool Britain, Northern Europe down a lot. And the shutdown of that current could throw us into an ice age.
It's scary either way.
No, well, we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to happen in our lifetime. We don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. But, I mean, if you want to be altruistic and say, well, look what we're doing. Are we doing this for our great-grandchildren? Maybe. Climate refugees is probably a more immediate thing we'd have to worry about. As a humanitarian thing, if you want to extend that to an economic argument, yeah. I mean, look at the aid we pour in after a natural disaster. This sort of thing would be a natural disaster that no one's ever seen before. Yes?
One of the things that we have talked about in this class is misconceptions and trying to help our students not have science misconceptions. And one of the concerns I always have about these conversations is that we vastly oversimplify cause and effect.
Yeah.
I think it's really easy for especially a young child to assume, well, if it gets a little warmer, I can handle it. Not understanding that our ecosystem is fragile.
Yeah.
And understanding that a tipping point may not seem like a big thing unless you understand the huge complexity of the system. We can't even anticipate. I don't think we even begin to understand all the potential tipping points that could happen.
Yep.
And for me, as a teacher, that's my main thing to teach my students is one of the things we have evidence for is that we're messing with this.
Yep.
We're affecting this. We can't anticipate the outcome. But the fact that we know that we're making changes by our actions and we can change our actions
Yep.
is the critical thing for our students to understand. We make choices. Just like 40 years ago, we made choices to smoke cigarettes.
Yep.
I grew up with my parents literally smoking at the dinner table.
Yeah.
I mean, with a burning cigarette in an ashtray at the dinner table. Can you even conceive of that now?
No.
I mean, we can't even conceive of that now. So we can change our behavior and change the outcome, but you know, it's our choices.
Yep.
And that complexity is what we need to teach our kids, is that you're making choices, we're making choices that have really long-term effects on complex things.
Yep.
So I think the hard thing for us is to not make the argument be about polar bears.
Yeah.
That pulls at our heartstrings and it gets us energized about making choices, but scientifically, as a teacher, as a scientist,
Yeah.
I think we need to convey the complexity of it, because the fact that you think you can anticipate what's going to happen might not arm you well.
Yeah. No.
You're talking about climate refugees. We have no clue where that could take us.
No.
clue.
No. Well, we can only sort of analogously
Right.
look at disasters and what the
Right.
response was to
And
that.
still, we've oversimplified it because
Yeah.
we don't get it.
Well, and I mean, I agree with you 100%, but there's an area of psychology where they've looked at the whole climate change debate, and they've sort of looked at, say, so why has there been so much inaction? And because part of the problem is it's just so overwhelming.
Right.
Like, how can me, whatever, not driving 2 days a week actually change something? And the answer is not, like, it won't. But if everyone does, I mean, it can only help. So, I mean, you're 100% right. I think people look at polar bears because it's something like, here's a polar bear. The introduction to the whole thing, it's a bit less overwhelming. You can go to the zoo and talk about them, that sort of thing. But, no, you're right. I mean, and it's not easy. It's not easy. There's a lot of money involved, which makes it even harder. But I don't want to leave you on like a doom and gloom sort of point. So let me keep going here.
We do have to depart for the zoo in a little over 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll go quick. Pretty pictures of So just pretty pictures of animals that live in this area. All of them messed with my monitoring system. What we are up here doing was looking at, okay, is the Arctic right now, is it putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere or is it bringing it down? With the idea of, okay, with respect to the greenhouse effect, how is the Arctic that's going to change? How is it going to interact? Is it going to be a modulating effect or is it going to contribute to the greenhouse effect? Just as an idea of adaptation, since that was sort of the original tie-in here, these Arctic hares, because there's no trees, they'll actually run on their hind legs to keep an eye on you. And then if they get really scared, they'll get down on all four and just beetle out there. But it's hilarious to see. They sort of look over their shoulder and keep going. Because they can see much more of the landscape that way. In a forest, obviously, that wouldn't be a great strategy, and they would get eaten by the wolf. All right. So if we heat up the Arctic, I mentioned that permafrost before. One of the effects of this permafrost, the heating would be that permafrost would melt. So rather than having all the soil totally frozen, we'd have this layer where plants could use the soil, access resources, much like they would down here. So it becomes a much more hospitable environment. The concern here is that there's a lot of organic matter locked up in Arctic soils. And one of the consequences of this is that organisms in the soils can eat this organic matter and put out lots of CO2. So the alarmist would say, wow, if we warm up the Arctic, we'll start decomposing all this material, buried forests, okay, lots of CO2 into the atmosphere. But we did a study that showed that, in fact, this wasn't the case, right? So basically, that whole argument is, okay, if we heat things up, are we going to decompose organic matter and produce CO2? Or if there's photosynthesis, all green plants photosynthesize, they draw down CO2 to produce biomass and oxygen. So drawing down CO2, putting CO2 up. What's happening in the Arctic now? Well, it turns out that it's drawing it down. Negative means CO2 coming from the atmosphere into the soils. Positive means coming from the soils back out into the atmosphere. This is over, I guess, 4-month period for 2 years. And you can see that generally we are slightly below. So right now in this polar desert with very minimal vegetation, photosynthesis is winning. It's actually drawing CO2 down from the atmosphere. It's a sink.
So could this give us more ideas of other ways we could draw carbon? I mean, with these studies, we could figure out other ways to draw the carbon and CO2 levels down?
Yeah,
That's the
something
idea.
as easy as planting plants in this case.
Uh-huh.
So in the Arctic, we're drawing down CO2. If we increase vegetation in the Arctic, if we forest the Arctic, we put more leaves there that will draw down CO2 even more. And we know this because we can look at other sites in Canada. Okay, these are the farthest south sites where we have the most dramatic drawdown during the day. Down here, though, we get nighttime. So we turn off the lights, photosynthesis goes away, and we actually, during the night, put CO2 back into the atmosphere. Not a problem in the high Arctic, though, because we never turn out the lights. And when we do, it's cold. It's the winter time. We don't get that kick back in. So in the high Arctic, if we increase leaf area, more photosynthesis will draw down CO2 even more. Yes?
That goes back to his point of it being a localized issue, because that's really great if you're in that particular part of the earth.
Yep.
What happens when you are in Arizona in the desert?
Well, you've got to look at the atmosphere as being mixed, which is why Barrow, Alaska reported 400 ppm 6 months earlier than the rest of the world did. So they detected it there first, but the atmosphere gets mixed. The entire atmosphere rose in CO2. So CO2 might have point sources, but it gets distributed around the atmosphere. And the Arctic, in a forested Arctic, will continue to draw that CO2 down. So
As long as there's enough of a forested area in the Arctic, we're good, sort of.
that's the idea. It's not so simple, but that's the idea.
Okay.
So a ray of hope at the end of the talk. It's not all doom and gloom.